Thank you for coming to our session on reporting the Rohingya crisis. My name's Sam Dubberley. I'm moderating this session, and I'm with Amnesty International, working on digital verification and social media. Last August, militant attacks led to a military operation in Rakhine state in western Myanmar, which of late last year has led to at least 624,000 people, Rohingya people, fleeing to Bangladesh. The NGO International Crisis Group has called it one of the fastest refugee exoduses in modern times. The United Nations, a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. So in our panel today, we're going to discuss how the situation developed to August, September 2017, experiences of writing and reporting and witnessing the crisis, how it was reported, and where we are now. So to do so, I have Aela Callan. Aela's a filmmaker and journalist. She's reported from Myanmar, from within Myanmar from 2012 to 2014, before becoming a Knight Fellow at Stanford University, where she explored ways that media in Myanmar could counteract online hate speech and misinformation. She's the executive producer of the 360-degree documentary I Am Rohingya, and is currently developing a multi-user virtual reality documentary. We also have Tirana Hassan. Tirana's Director of Crisis Response at Amnesty International, and she leads a team which specializes in rapid deployment to document international humanitarian law and human rights violations in times of conflict and crisis. She was previously Senior Emergencies Researcher at Human Rights Watch and has spent the last 15 years in war zones and crisis spots around the world. And Hannah McKay is a photographer for Reuters news agency based out of London. This crisis was the first international crisis she covered for Reuters, and we can see her pictures up on the screen here, which are really quite remarkable. This is a quote from her experience. "You are there trying to do your job with a camera in your hand, and then your heart overrules your head. I had been in the camps where everything was quite settled, but then I saw the real chaos and the refugees' desperate situation. You hear about it, but seeing it is a completely different thing." So Hannah, I'm going to kick off with you as we go through your pictures, which are really, really incredibly powerful and incredibly moving and really capture, at least for me, the essence of this crisis. You said seeing it is a completely different thing. Can you talk us through that? What did it mean to you to actually be there?
Is this working? Hello? Yeah. So because it was my first assignment, I'd only been in the job with Reuters for 3 months. I went into the situation a little bit naive, completely fearless. I didn't really know what to expect, and I think actually in some sense, sorry, is that better? Yeah, so because it was my first assignment, I didn't really know what to expect. I was a little bit naive. I went into the situation fearless, and I think actually that helped in the pictures that I was taking and the situations that I put myself in. You always need to make sure that your safety comes first, but ultimately, as a photographer, a journalist, you want to get the best pictures you can get.
Cool. And Tirana, what's the thing that stuck in your head from September? You were there from early September?
Yeah,
in Cox's Bazaar?
I think we deployed, by the time I actually got to Cox's Bazaar, it was about 1 week into the crisis. And I remember the moment very clearly when we decided that we needed to go, and it was a piece on Al Jazeera, actually, not saying that just because you're on the panel. And it was footage of a biblical scene of people wading across the Naf River. And Amnesty International had covered the Rohingya, the situation of the Rohingya for many years. We knew about what has happened there in the past. I had worked with Human Rights Watch covering it in 2012 when the Rohingya violence erupted then. Amnesty had just done a report in 2016, and so when we saw these people literally carrying their children above their heads and walking across the River Naf, we didn't see a refugee crisis. we saw something very, very dark and knew that something very, very evil was most likely happening outside of what we could see. And so our sole purpose of deploying at that time was to find out, was not to document a refugee crisis, was not to document an influx of refugees into Bangladesh. It was to find out what was driving these people. And we had our suspicions, but you just didn't know. And I think just on the final point is, I don't think anyone could have prepared themselves for what it was like in those first few days. It was truly chaotic. You couldn't take an interview because you had the ethical dilemma, and I think we'll get into this later, of people who had literally jumped on boats with absolutely nothing, people who had walked for 10 days, had not eaten, who were clearly traumatized. So do you stop them? And is the first thing you do when they reach Myanmar soil, because that's where we were, right on the border, is sit down and interview them for 45 minutes about possibly what would be the worst things ever imaginable.
Okay. Before we come back to that, we will. I'd like to rewind a bit to Aela, to your period of actually being in Myanmar in 2012. I was in a conference in Yangon in 2014, the East-West Center Conference in Yangon, which was supposed to be this great opening funded by the State Department. Myanmar is opening up to the world. Everything is going to be great. Can you tell us a bit about your experience, Aela, from 2012 to 2014?
Yeah, so I think you can't look at the latest crisis without taking into account what led us to that point. During this particular crisis, I was sitting in Yangon breastfeeding my 4-month-old daughter, watching the culmination of years of kind of build-up of resentment that had been allowed to foster in Rakhine State kind of explode. And this was another feeling, because I had been in these situations covering this story, and then at that point was really unable to be on the ground. So I was very much working on it from the inside of Myanmar side, and when we went to film I'm Rohingya, we were doing fact-checking and verifying on the Myanmar side while we had Zara and the crew shooting in Bangladesh, and I can talk more about that later. But back in 2012, I was one of the first journalists to be given a visa to live in Myanmar, foreign journalists to be given a visa to live in Myanmar, and it was such an exciting time. You'd had the disappointment of the 2010 election when we had seen, essentially military people re-elected, but then no one expected Aung San Suu Kyi to be released and the country to open up as quickly as it had. And one of the first things about the liberalisation of the country was they released controls on the media very, very quickly. So you had a situation where literally from overnight, I was sneaking around doing undercover work for Al Jazeera, not able to use my real name, sneaking across borders to a situation where I had an official visa to live there, and the media could say anything it wanted. There was no legacy media, no free newspapers at the time, no free freedom of speech in terms of television, and everyone just jumped on Facebook. It was the first thing, and anyone could publish. So you had this situation where people really felt like Facebook was the internet and everything on it was true. And no one used their real names, and speech just spread very, very quickly across the country. There wasn't a lot of people connected at that time, but one of the most disturbing things was that when there was an incident in Rakhine State in 2012 where some Muslim men were accused of raping a Buddhist woman, you saw that spread at lightning speed across to the other side of the country, places like Mandalay and Meghtila, where Muslims, not necessarily Rohingya Muslims, because there is a difference in Myanmar, were being targeted because of religion. You've got to remember this was a country where everyone was repressed by the military. All of a sudden, freedom of speech opened up and people didn't have the common enemy anymore. And they kind of, especially in Rakhine State, turned on each other. And the seeds of what was sown then, the othering the hate speech, the misinformation that was going unchecked on Facebook primarily, led to a situation where in 2017 you have the military going absolutely berserk, and we shouldn't forget that it was in response to attacks against them. There were attacks against the Myanmar police at that point, but the backlash against that was so horrific and so over the top. But by that stage, everyone in Myanmar was immune to it because there'd been so much of othering going on for the past 5 years that it was, in a sense, okay for it to happen. And so where people say, why hasn't Aung San Suu Kyi spoken out? Why has this been allowed to happen? In the context of Myanmar, it absolutely makes sense. We could all see it coming.
I'm going to stay with the Facebook issue, actually, because in 2013, there's a Turkish-American sociologist, Zeynep Tüfekci. She said, last year, I pondered the first social media-fueled ethnic cleansing. Is it Burma, ? That was in 2013. And then she went on this year to say, just last year, if I was worried as early as 2013, Facebook should have had a giant emergency team. What would you say to that?
Well, interestingly, I can see Georgie Pradeski over here from JSK, who knows that in 2013 I stood on a stage at Stanford and said, are we seeing the beginnings of the world's first digital genocide? Which seemed extreme in some quarters at the time, but we were trying to get them to take it seriously. At that point, Facebook had one Myanmar translator, one Burmese language translator, and it wasn't that they didn't take the issue seriously, it was that they had no idea about the way the platform was being used, a technology that was made essentially for college kids in the United States. How does that impact on an emerging democracy in a place like Myanmar? It's a completely different cultural context, and at that stage, there wasn't a sense of how this would play out at all. I never expected to see the same issues, fake news, hate speech, explode in such a way so quickly in the United States. Like we were saying, Myanmar's like a test tube. What's happening here could happen in other places, and then it did, very, very quickly, way quicker than I would imagine it did. So yeah, I completely agree with those comments. And there was a bit of a disbelief at that point.
So Tirana, what's Amnesty's position on hate speech on platforms like Facebook and in these kind of situations?
If I can just, before I get to that point, I mean, going back to 2012, I remember that time when there was violence in Rakhine State involving the Rohingya and the Rakhine, and it was exactly as Ella said. This is where we first started seeing Facebook being used as a tool, except the fake news and the fake photographs, they were being sent through SMS. They were being sent through, not particularly smartphones, moderately intelligent phones. So these grainy pictures would turn up and activists would show it to us, and it would be both Rakhine or from the Rohingya side, but a lot of it was not true. A lot of it was fake. So, the misinformation campaign was being generated outside of Facebook. It was sometimes it was about manipulation, sometimes it was just about the people being desperate to have you look at their story. And the reality is, it's hard to tell you about how isolated the Rohingya are up in northern Rakhine State particularly. Amnesty actually has called the government's policy system, the actual system that the Rohingya live in this area, amounts to a system of apartheid. It's beyond that they are made an other. There is a complicated system of laws, of local orders, of bylaws at the local level that mean that you can't walk outside of your village to go to a market without a pass, that you need to go to an administrative body to get that pass to be able to pass the checkpoints. You can't fish, you can't have X amount of cows. without having permission. So that is the context. So when people got access to information, they didn't know anything about vetting. They just believed everything that was coming through these magic platforms, except the photos we saw were photos that we had seen in Cyclone Nargis, which was in Myanmar. We saw photos of Iraq.
Pakistan.
Yeah, Pakistan, all sorts of things. And we said, this isn't true. Except, and then it started, you know, Facebook, it was happening on Facebook, but Facebook just wasn't big because, as we were saying, there wasn't that much access. You know, people, certainly the Rohingya, it was the diaspora who had access to Facebook, but the Rohingya inside the country had very limited access. And I remember sitting, and this is where I think there's an important point to be made, because we can go after Facebook, and Facebook, you're not going to have me go soft on Facebook. There is a lot that they should have done. There is a lot that they can be doing. However, maybe we all need to take a step back and look at the conversations back in 2012, because I sat around a table with a lot of the key actors who are still working on Rakhine State, and we talked about the misinformation on Facebook. We talked about the fake photographs. We talked about the lack of verification, and we said, is this the right time to be restricting people's ability to communicate openly? Are we, after campaigning for decades for freedom of expression and a free media and for citizens to have a voice inside the country, is the first thing that we're going to say is we need to curb this because this is hate speech?
Yeah, I completely agree, and particularly as a journalist working on this issue, the last thing I was advocating was for controls, and I completely agree with what Tirana was saying. Facebook didn't create the problem, it gave a platform to the problem and allowed it to spread at lightning speed. So while the Rohingya themselves and the Rakhine themselves were not very well connected, for the first time you saw that information taken up by other groups in the rest of the country, and it spread. It's very difficult. I don't know how many of you have covered Myanmar, but the ethnic groups are very separate, whether you're Kachin, whether you're Shan, whether you're Rohingya, whether you're Bama. They see themselves as very separate. But here was a platform that was connecting everybody, and the grievances of the Rakhine became the grievances of people sitting in Mandalay, became the grievances of people in Mektila, where you literally had people who had lived next door to each other, Muslim and Buddhist, for decades, maybe even centuries, turn on each other in a very violent way.
Okay, well, I think we'll come back to the misinformation bit, but I'd like to come back to what you just talked about before, Ela, which was the ARSA side of it. It often doesn't get talked about. So that ARSA is the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. So talk to us a little bit about the growth of an organization like ARSA within Rakhine State and how that happened, could have happened, and how the changes in their strategy might have actually led to what happened in August, September.
Well, I think it's a very, I believe this is a problematic characterization, but I haven't found of a better way to express it. The Muslim community in Myanmar in 2012 was one of the least radicalized. I hate that characterization, but people were not talking about attacking the system or anything back then. It was very peaceful. And after Mektila, you saw a lot of anger, particularly among the young men in the mosques. And it was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Buddhists were scared of a Muslim uprising. It wasn't likely to happen. But then they kind of, put all these 200,000 people in camps since 2012 and left them to languish there under this apartheid system, which didn't exist before, and you almost saw the uprising. You could watch it happening. All it needed was a spark. All it needed was someone to come and say to a bunch of young men, let's go train to be terrorists, and that's essentially what happened. We know the influence of outside actors, particularly from the Middle East, have really fueled that violence there. And so when you did see what would be regarded as perhaps a minor attack on police and military outposts in 2017, you see the army just rise up and go ballistic, essentially. And you see them do that with the support of the vast majority of the Burma ethnic, well, the main group in public in Myanmar. They supported that uprising against the Rohingya because of the othering that I talked about.
Was Amnesty looking at these issues?
So on the ARSA side, for sure, I mean, there's two things to it. We need to make sure that whenever the narrative about what happened on August 25th is being told, that most certainly there were attacks on, I believe it was 11 security official or government, I think it was 10 security police officers or border guard police and 1 immigration officer were killed in a series of coordinated attacks, unsophisticated coordinated attacks. It is very difficult, and I think there are a lot of people who are covering the Rohingya story for many years who are trying to understand more about the impact of the ARSA attacks, but it's very difficult to do because there's not a lot known about ARSA. We hear that they took a lot of casualties in those attacks, so it was completely disproportionate versus the attack versus what happened in retaliation. But, you know, it is important to put into context that there were a series of attacks, and actually, you know, when you look actually at some of the places where the worst violence took place, you actually need to look at, were those the places where some of those attacks took place? Or were they places that may have been targeted before? I say all of this, and then I'm going to contradict myself by saying there is not a snowball's chance in hell that you can justify the reaction from the Myanmar military. There's not a snowball's chance in hell, as well as there's just no way when you look at the legal analysis of it about whether it was proportionate. The army did go ballistic. Even the most seasoned of Myanmar watchers sat back in shock, saying, we knew one day it was going to be bad. We had no idea it was this bad. And the other very frightening thing was we never thought that the population, the general population, would get so far behind the military that you would hear people that were trusted friends of democracy and human rights saying, well, maybe the army hasn't gone far enough. And so that, you know, those were the very frightening things, but we do ourselves a real disservice when we don't report on the background and the context, whether that's the context of this was a tinderbox that is related to something much more than what happened in August 2017, and we don't do ourselves any favours when we don't mention that there was an insurgent group and we don't look at the root causes behind how that insurgent group actually emerged. It was not the first insurgent group for the Rohingya. There had been other iterations of that in the past.
Can I just jump in quickly and talk about one other very underreported element of this? For the Rohingya, they are also under threat by extremists within their communities who, for instance, are said to be beheading people who do deal with the government. So the peacemakers, those who are actually engaging in dialogue with the decision makers of the country, are then targeted by extremists in their own community, and there's backlash there too. This has been almost impossible, with the exception of very few cases, to verify because the government closed access to those areas. So where they could have done themselves a favour by allowing media to go up to those areas and to look into these stories, they shut it down. And Where I see Aung San Suu Kyi's government becoming very problematic is with things like that. If they had allowed access, journalists could have gone up and spoken to people who were scared. But if on one side you've got the military attacking you, and on the other side you've got people from within your own community saying, don't start talking peace with the Rakhine, or don't start talking peace with the government, you're kind of in a bad place. And a lot of people fled because of that. You were between a rock and a hard place. You could do nothing. And so they left. So when Aung San Suu Kyi's government gets up and says there is misinformation, they're right. It doesn't justify what the military has done, and it doesn't mean they shouldn't be doing other actions, but there's enough mud in the water that they can actually say and believe, I honestly think they believe, that the driving force was these extremists from ASA. And a lot of people did leave because of that as well. It doesn't mean that it's one or the other. But it's very hard for us as reporters to tell that story. It's very complicated. We like black and white narratives because it paints it as Myanmar government bad, military bad, Rohingya good. You know, it's so much more nuanced than that. And that's a much harder story for us to tell.
So let's move on to August, September. Hannah, you were in Cox's Bazaar.
Yeah, so end of October I went to Cox's.
Sorry, end of October you were in
for
Cox's
3
Bazaar.
weeks. So by this point, thousands had crossed. The majority of people had crossed the border into Bangladesh, and so when I arrived, I didn't know what to expect, but I knew for my time there, I was the eyes on the ground, and I had a responsibility to show the world what was happening there. And truthfully, as we were discussing, it's important that it is the truth of what's happening. So the first sort of week or so, I spent time in the camps, and that was it was very calm. People were obviously relieved to cross safely, and were just setting up their life as they could. It's cramped, it's smelly, it's everything you'd expect and more, and it's so big pictures don't do it justice of what's actually happening there. It's impossible to show the scale of life in the camps, but to begin with, it's settled there, and you hear the stories and they're horrific, but I knew as a photographer it was important for me to show what was happening there.
And how did you go about on a day-to-day basis? You landed up there with probably not so much preparation. It was your first assignment, international assignment as a Reuters photographer. How was it at the start, the preparation, the getting there, the setting yourself up, the starting to make contacts?
It was tiring. It's a long way from London to Cox's Bazaar, but it was just about finding your feet and finding the area, and the camps are next door to each other, so it's very easy to move between them all, and actually they're all very, very similar. There's shops and there's market stalls, and there's just their houses everywhere. So it was a case of just wandering around really and seeing what I could find. And what struck me most was the access that I had as a photographer, and being able to say that I work for Reuters is a huge thing out there, and it's not something that I'm used to for working in the UK. It's a photographer and a camera is often seen as a negative thing, whereas out there it was the complete opposite, and it was really encouraging to be able to walk into clinics and just take photos. And I think it was quite obvious quite quickly that the refugees could see that I could help them. I couldn't help each individual, but in taking the photographs, my photographs showed the world what was happening there, and that was quite nice to be able to show that.
And like in the 17 days that you were there, 17 days in total, right? So how do you think your work changed in that period?
At the beginning, I was quite shy, I'd say, because I wasn't used to being able to walking into people's homes or women's clinics and saying, can I take pictures? Not once did anybody say you can't take pictures. So at the beginning, it was just for me a personal barrier to get over that. And as the time went on, you gain confidence in yourself and as a photographer, and also with the people. You know, I'd be walking along and stop to take a picture, and I'd turn around and have 30 refugees fascinated in me being there. And sometimes it was amazing, and sometimes it was a bit of a hindrance, because it puts off the subject matter I'm trying to take a photograph of. So, but yeah, as the time went on, I realised what it was I was trying to show. The camps was great. Everybody was so welcoming, even though we didn't speak the same language. You're able to communicate with the camera. And then towards the end of the trip, there was a crossing, which you would have seen in some of the photographs. And that was the highlight of the trip, in terms of I was able to show the life in the camps and how life works now that they've crossed to safety. But then I also had this situation where I was able to show the world their desperation, and it was incredible. It was so overwhelming as a photographer to see this, and it happened so quickly. It was like a breaking news incident, but I also knew that it was important to try and show as much of what was happening as possible.
Tirana, you were there a bit earlier, and you just said before that when you went there, you knew something very dark was happening, and it wasn't just a refugee crisis, it was something a lot more. Tell us a bit about your decision as Amnesty to deploy to Cox's Bazar, and the slight difference in terms of what Amnesty tries to do in these situations compared to what an organisation like Reuters would be trying to do.
Sure. So, you know, it's really because we have had a long history of working inside Myanmar, as well as on the Rohingya, the situation of the Rohingya. And we were actually already 1 year into our research. Our Myanmar researcher was already at least a year into the research about looking at this system of apartheid. And so in August, when this situation erupted, we were already having debates saying, does the evidence that we have, do all of these laws, does this level of segregation, does this institutionalized discrimination, is this actually a system of apartheid? Because that's going to have serious repercussions on the Rohingya, on our work in Myanmar. And so we were looking at the legal merits of if it met the legal threshold, because the crime of apartheid is actually a crime that can be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. So it's a very serious legal question for us, and we have to analyse the evidence. So, you know, that's going on in the background. So yes, we knew all of this, and that's why we went with the understanding that, you know, we knew what the push, because this is not the first push of Rohingya refugees into Bangladesh. It started in the 1970s. It's the 70s, it's the 90s, it's throughout 2012, 2016, and now. And so we knew what those push factors were, and so we went in. Our purpose for going there is very clear. We aren't a news organisation. We are not there to tell the story of what's happening. We are there to say what drove these people. What was it that was happening to them inside Myanmar? We knew, like, we have a big refugee rights program at Amnesty. We would cover the refugee angle, but now wasn't the time. Our job was to get there to find out what was driving these people, what was forcing them to flee into Bangladesh, to walk across the Naf River, holding only their children above their heads. And we knew to get from towns like Mongdo, which was the closest, okay, that was relatively easy, but some of these people were coming from places called Butidong and other villages which were much further up, and we knew, like, that's a 10, 12, 14-day walk over a mountain range, like, what's happening. And our job is to say what happened, but not just that, it's like, who did it? Who is doing this? Because it might not matter today, but it certainly is going to matter later on. And the other part of it is to make sure that we're doing whatever we can as Amnesty International to ensure that there's immediate action. So whilst, you know, whilst colleagues from the media are out there doing their nightly broadcast, telling the stories, telling the human face and the suffering, and beginning to look at what was driving people, what were the stories that forced them to flee, we were actually doing a live broadcast to New York, to the Security Council, with all of the information in conjunction with our colleagues from, I think it was Human Rights Watch. We were actually briefing the UN media circle. And we were on the phone every day to our advocates in Geneva and New York, and I had colleagues who were in Yangon and feeding them in the stories that we were hearing, and they were going to the diplomats. And I can tell you that it's like parallel universes. You know, all of a sudden, you cannot underestimate the love affair that the West has with Aung San Suu Kyi, and I think we need to talk about the myth of Aung San Suu Kyi later, but you know, nobody wanted to, first of all, she doesn't control the military, so we weren't actually saying that she needed to be the target, but nobody wanted to listen to what we were saying. There was a deep level of resistance in those first few days, and our job as Amnesty is to push through that resistance and say, you don't have time to continue with your fantasy that this is a functioning democracy. You have to snap out of this and take the sort of action that is required and send the sort of messages to get these, you know, out of control military back in line. You need to be sending messages now saying that, you know, these could be war crimes, or that if you're selling weapons to the Myanmar military, then you should be starting to feel very, very uncomfortable, because we have the evidence to show that it was the Myanmar military who went into this village, opened fire on fleeing civilians. Here are the photographs that we took of the bullet entry wounds through the back and the exit wounds through the chest. That shows you that these people were running away at the time, and that's why we go. We're not there necessarily to, I mean, I'm not a journalist, so I don't want to sort of say why journalists cover these things, but we were very clear. It was to try and move the narrative and make sure it wasn't being talked about as a refugee crisis.
You're not a journalist, and you're not a journalist. But you know, you were there at the same time as news organizations, you know, such as Reuters, and you obviously collaborated a lot with them. So how does that collaboration work from a Reuters side to organizations like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, other NGOs, MSF, and vice versa? Open to all of you, really. I
mean, I can give a couple of examples, actually. Some of our most important work in those first few days, because it was really chaotic, was actually from talking to people like Simon Lewis, from Reuters, who was there doing extraordinary reporting and was there before us. And Sam Jahan, the photographer from AP, who was doing incredible stuff and was, you know, they were really on the front line well before anybody else. And when we arrived, I'll be really honest with you, and I mean, taking off my Amnesty hat and just being a human being, when I first heard some of those stories, even for me, I've covered war crimes and conflicts for a while now, I was like, surely this can't be true. There were some stories that I thought were too brutal. There were some stories that I was right. They probably were part of a narrative that may not have been true. It's, you know, it's what happens within the Rohingya population, but it's also what happens in these situations. You hear about something that happened in another village, it begins to build momentum, so that's why the verification part is so important. And very difficult also. But I would say that trying to sift through some of the things that I had heard was very difficult. And so speaking to Sam and to Simon, when they were saying, look, I heard this story, I was like, well, so did I. And all of a sudden we were saying we would be able to triangulate enough to be able to say, okay, this is something worth looking into. This is the village we need to focus on. Because, you know, literally imagine just seas of people coming at you from different villages, hundreds and hundreds of different locations. How do you pin it down? You have to pin down, we decided to go through the angle of going village by village and trying to work out where the most serious stuff happened. So I think our collaboration, both on photographs, on different things, but also on saying, oh, journalists don't have the time to follow everything. So they were saying, look, I heard about this story, you know, I had to file, so I didn't follow it, but there's something there, and then we would go out. And actually, one of the issues was from a Panos photographer who was there on assignment, who brought me to a village and said all of these people were shot in the back.
Yeah, and also, I think most people you meet along the way have actually been through very similar situations, so it's very hard to pinpoint one to being worse than the other. They're all so terrible that there's such a group of how do you help them all, and it is difficult to, you become quite yeah, and immune to what you hear because everybody's saying the same things, and it's terrible, but it's very difficult to know who to help.
I've always found it really hard covering this issue because there's the things you see with your eyes, and then there's the verification aspect. It's impossible to verify. You almost have to take off your Western journalistic mindset and look at it from a really different perspective. These are collectivist communities. You rape somebody, you rape everybody. It's something I've experienced also when dealing with North Korean defectors. They take bits of everybody's story and it becomes this composite, terrible narrative, and everyone has the same narrative. One baby was thrown on the fire, everyone you talk to says that. Word spreads among the community itself that this has happened. They're all looking for a way out, and they will tell you the most shocking thing they've heard. Did it happen to you? Is really hard, because even in the language, there is no difference between did it happen today, did it happen yesterday, is it going to happen tomorrow? So when you're working with a translator who's there, you know, is she saying this was yesterday, is she saying that's what she's going to do? It's really hard to nail that level of detail down. So what we know about dealing with victims of trauma is that it's very important for them to be believed. And in that moment where a woman is in tears before you telling a story, of course, you want to believe them. But it does become very important that we do some sort of fact-checking and that we do verify stories beyond the breaking news element of it. For I Am Rohingya, we went to extraordinary lengths to try and verify the story of our main character, Jamalita, because we felt you couldn't have an immersive VR experience with someone whose story could be questioned. You couldn't have her standing before you saying what happened with someone saying, well, actually, that's not right. She's not from that village, or that didn't happen on that date. So, you know, we had to look at it in a completely different way from what we would normally as breaking news media. Day-to-day media, you want the exclusive story. You want the thing that no one else has got. In this sense, I went back and found the person who had spoken the most to journalists along the way, because I could triangulate her story and I could send researchers to say, was she there at that date? Did she, you know, what changed about her story on the way? And I was using other media reports to verify how she came and basic things to see, it sounds horrible, but to see if she was telling me the truth sounds terrible to say. But it was important in this instance because this wasn't a piece of breaking news journalism. This was a piece that would exist as a much more immersive piece that would be shown at film festivals and that a lot of people around the world would see. And so in that sense, that piece of journalism was very important to have verified.
I think there's a case in there, isn't there, that what we saw a lot happening throughout the crisis was one little ounce of misattributed content being shared, and we saw it from the Turkish Deputy Prime Minister who put out a tweet, and then Aung San Suu Kyi called Erdogan to say, we're just at the tip of a fake news iceberg or something like that. So if you'd had anything in your whole video, and I want to show the trailer in a second, it would have kind of blown out of the water, right? Mm.
And she can stand there and say there's misinformation, because there is. It doesn't mean that the stories aren't valid, and it doesn't mean that babies weren't thrown on fires and that women weren't raped. But she can ignore all that because of this tiny seed of doubt, and that's really damaging for the issue as a whole. As if it's not bad enough already, we've got this misinformation thing on top.
Yeah, I mean, it's a slight pivot from your point, but since we're on this moment where Aung San Suu Kyi called out the misinformation and the iceberg, this is the tip of the iceberg. It's there's a whole sea of misinformation out there. She made that in her first public address, right, to the nation. There's another part, and I think that all of us need to be much better at saying fake information or misinformation isn't just about a doctored photo or a video from Iraq that gets a Rohingya banner on it and thrown on YouTube. It's actually also when the Myanmar military, the perpetrators of this crime, cobble together an investigative panel, go out, investigate the massacre, and go, nothing to see here, move along. That is also part of the misinformation campaign, and we don't focus enough on that. We aren't reporting on that because I think particularly from outside of the country, and I'm going to say generically the West, we tend to just think, yeah, of course it's not going to be legitimate. But it's legitimate to people in the country. And if we're not calling it out, if we're not putting attention on the fact that there have been sham investigations to cover this up, then we don't actually help later on when we're trying to work with the Rohingya people for real justice and accountability. Because we can be countered with, well, there was an investigation mechanism, and then we have to backtrack 5 years and say, well, this is the reason why it wasn't credible at the time. So when we talk about misinformation, I think we need to have this whole thing, and when we talk about who's responsible for this, we need to move beyond, the new Burma, everyone's got the T-shirt with Aung San Suu Kyi's face on it or the coffee mug or whatever, and say, well, you know what, we got to learn another name here, and that name is Min Aung Hlaing, and he is the commander-in-chief. And one of the biggest issues I had with a lot of the reporting, I think there was a lot of brilliant reporting, I think the agent news providers were really committed to this story, but it was all about Aung San Suu Kyi. What difference does it make if they take away her, this is my personal opinion, not Amnesty's, her Nobel Peace Prize? Okay, it's symbolic, fine, but people are dying. People at that stage, in the days when people wanted to debate, and you were getting op-eds about debating whether taking away her Nobel Peace Prize was going to be the big thing, people were still being killed by the Myanmar military. And we weren't hearing that Myanmar military forces commanded by Min Aung Hlaing are committing these sort of things. We were focusing on the name that everyone knew. And I think there is a responsibility when you are documenting mass atrocities, when you are reporting on crimes against humanity, that we might need to be pushing through into some of the darker things and changing the narrative. And I don't know, it's certainly, I feel like it's the job of organizations like Amnesty. I'm not sure, is it the job of news organizations?
For Reuters, it's about honesty and showing the world what we're seeing on the ground. So I think from our point of view, it's about that.
I think it's difficult. There's only so much time news organisations can devote to a story. There's for Al Jazeera anyway, there's Syria happening, there's all these other things that are in the news bulletin. But I do think, in the broader contextual pieces, it is worth looking at, and it is a story that needs to be told. It's a harder one to stick because people come to a story with certain assumptions. Aung San Suu Kyi is the most recognisable thing, so that's why we chuck it in, because people go, oh, that's that country, that place. To then get to the point where, so there's a situation where she's in power, but she's not actually in power, she's not actually the president, the military's still in charge, there's, it's very complex to be able to say. And so I understand both sides, but I do think in the broader contextual reporting, there has been a lot of focus on Min Aung Hlaing. It's just whether that reaches the public. And I think media organisations need to do a better job of reaching people where they are to talk about those things, the groups that are interested in this story, finding them and telling that story or getting that content in front of them. And I think that's where there's a bit of a breakdown.
I just wanted to show part of I Am Rohingya, if we can get the screen up, just a trailer, and have Aela talk us through a little bit about how that worked. I'm just aware of time, and I want to also make sure we have time for some questions.
How what worked?
How the process you went through, but if I can actually play it, that would be, do we have?
Every day.
Pulling it out and there you go. Okay. Seem to have some kind of, might be technically let down. Let's see. Maybe it's a screen issue. Should I try it on the...
I mean, I can talk a bit about how we approach this differently to the filming of a normal documentary film. It definitely was different because with a 360 video, obviously there's no camera to get behind. So you're kind of thinking about the worlds, if you like, that you're creating, and instead of hundreds of shots like you would have in one documentary where you edit together and you have editorial control, in a 360 video we had 20 shots in this whole thing, and so we were like, how can we best tell this story in those 20 shots? What are we seeing? We don't have control over where people are looking, so what are the cues that we can use to make people sort of see her story? We did, so I did several interviews with Jamalita before we even started filming. We had translators on the ground, real time, getting transcripts to me and me talking to the crew in the field and saying, she talked about this, can we go and get a scene of this? It was very chaotic, and there were things that in hindsight, you listen back to the interview and you're like, oh, we should have got to do this. But you're asking somebody so much time, and you're asking somebody really to get into their lives, and she was a willing participant in all that, but there comes a point at which you think, is making her relive her trauma a good thing or not? And one big frustration I had after doing this is that beyond the immersion, beyond putting people in that camp so they could see perhaps the scale of it and the day-to-day life and the human relatable things about her, so what, right? We don't feel, because we've been in that camp, that there's any thing we should go and do. People were like, oh, please tell Jamalita thank you for showing me there. I'm like, she doesn't know you've seen her. But so that sort of led me to what I'm working on now, which is, can we take people to places but also give them agency in that experience beyond floating in an immersive kind of world? Can we actually have them make choices and decisions and interact? And does that give us much more emotional ownership of that experience? Does that drive much more compassionate action beyond being immersed in this world?
Unfortunately, we've been let down a little bit by the technology, so we can't show the trailer, of course, but we have tweeted it out, so I would recommend everybody here to actually go and check it out, play it online, because it's really, really interesting, really fascinating, really compelling, at least for me personally. We talked a bit yesterday when we were preparing about the difference between you having the time to actually speak to Jalalila, actually go in depth with her, actually track her, get to know her. But then there was another side to that reporting of the trauma, which was the kind of the immediate reporting of the trauma. And there was a research paper released recently called Voices of Yazidi Women, Perceptions of Journalistic Practices in Reporting ISIS Sexual Violence, which noted that 85% of Yazidi women interviewed for the study had reported unethical practices by journalists when judged against the Dart Center for Journalism and Traumas guidelines. The Dart Center is based at Columbia University Journalism School. And Tirana, I mean, you saw some very similar practices, you think, around the Tulatoli massacre in particular, and where the same people were being effectively wheeled out for the cameras time and time again, which you found to be,
Yeah. So, I mean, across the board, I think there were a lot of ethical issues that anybody working in the camps, and especially in the early days, but even now, was confronted with, and they're not that different to dealing with many sort of chaotic breaking events. But I thought that they were particularly acute with the Rohingya because people arrived in such a traumatized state. Within a week, and this is a community that is incredibly isolated. So you can go and say, can I have permission to take your camera? I'm going to use this interview in a report. You can do the checkbox and say, I've done all the ethical things right, I've got all my permissions, etc. But I would challenge anyone, including myself, to say, how meaningful is that? Because these, particularly the women, remember that 70% of the population that came in the first weeks of the crossings were women alone and their children. These women have been completely isolated in their communities, in their country. They don't know what Facebook is. They have very little access to media. So I can say, I'm going to write a report and it's going to go on the web, so can I use your name because, we could have security implications. She'll say yes, but what is it? Is it really meaningful? And so that's on us, whether you're a human rights investigator or whether you're a journalist, to say, do I have the time to be able to go into this and really explain to her what it means to give an interview with me and what I'm going to do with this information? And if the answer is no, quite frankly, then we have to take a really strong, hard look at ourselves and ask, should we be doing this interview? And that was what we were confronted with a lot when we were sort of having people come off boats or crossing the river. And I guess it's the same when you're asking people, can I take your photograph and put it on the front page of the Times, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is some level of guilt as a photographer not being able to go back and say, hey, look, here's the finished product, because you just can't. And that's what you were just saying about your videos. You want to thank them all for giving you their time, but I think there's some level of understanding, not quite what you were just talking about, in that they understand that your tool as a camera helps in showing the world what's going on there. However, I also understand when you're speaking to people on a personal level, you need to make sure that they understand things.
Yeah. And sorry, go. Try explaining to a Rohingya woman she's going to be in VR. Like, yeah. I mean, it's totally, she thought we were entirely crazy and why we were going back and asking these questions. But the way I tried to do it as a person, not as a journalist, was because she'd interviewed so many times with other media, she knew the story. She was like straight talking about her rape, straight talking about all the horrible things, and it was up to us to say, so what else about you, Jamalita? What made you smile last? What is human and relatable about you? Like, bother to actually listen to their lives. What's your biggest concern today? Is there anything we can help you with immediately? Whether it's carrying a bucket of water, simple things that would make that happen. It's hard work. It's hard work to report like that, and we don't always have time, but I try to keep that at the centre of it. The second thing is media organisations, think about who you're sending to these situations. Do they have the country and cultural context? If you're just sending white men to report on this issue, then you're going to have a certain narrative emerge that is monolithic. Who is going? Hannah and I were speaking earlier about how it was a good thing and a bad thing, that as a woman she would get access to some spaces and not. You can't barge into a women's clinic and take pictures of rape victims if you're or rape survivors. Even the language we use is something. But you can't do that if you're a male photographer. So Hannah's pictures show that she got access to some of those spaces. But also, you said you didn't get access to other spaces.
It's the first time in my career that I experienced gender issues in terms of being a female photographer. I work in London, so I'm a minority amongst my peers because they are generally white middle-aged men. And so over there, I quite quickly realised that the access I was able to get as a female, the world also needed to see that because predominantly men had been in their situation. So I was able to go into women's clinics. I was able to go into diarrhea clinics where babies were sick on beds. I was able to go in with a pregnant lady having an examination and check things were okay. And that was great because my male colleague for Reuters was like, that's great because I can't do that. And I was like, yeah. But then on the other side, there are situations where women are forbidden, and I found that quite difficult to deal with because that's not something that I find in my general day-to-day work in the UK. So there was a funeral taking place, and I just happened to be driving down the road, and I said, stop the car, there's a line of people carrying a coffin. So I ran to the front, and I'm taking pictures, and I quite quickly realised a sense of unnervingness between the people and myself, and the fixer that I was with, who's able to speak the language and translate to me, said, you can't be here. And I said, oh, why? And he said, because you're a woman. And for me, that's like, I'm all for equality. So I took that as an offence. And he explained to me, if you look around, there's not a single female here. They don't come to the funeral. It's a man thing. And so off they went to the grave, and I'm stood at the bottom of the hill, and I was pleading with him to get him to speak to the refugees to allow me in. And in the end, they did, and they said, as long as you take your shoes off, you can come up to the grave and take one picture. And I was really grateful to them, and I kept saying, thank you, which they I don't think they understand what I was saying, but for me, that was quite a big hurdle to deal with because it's not something that I deal with on a day-to-day basis.
But news organisations bother to find out. These are conservative, highly conservative Muslim communities. What are the red lines? You know, taking your shoes off in Buddhist culture, or not taking your shoes off in Buddhist culture, is highly offensive. Don't walk into a monastery with your shoes on. Those sort of basic things. When there's a breaking news situation, people often don't find out until they're there, which is why, you know, sending people who don't have the context is problematic.
Okay. I know we could carry on this discussion forever, and it would be amazing. But I want to just throw it open in the last, we have 5-7 minutes left. I think if I take like 2 questions or 3 questions. Yeah, first one there. With that, yeah.
Hi there, I'm Jasmine Bayoumi. I also work at Al Jazeera English. Well, first of all, thank you all for doing this great reporting. But there's something that I've noticed, and it is, we're talking about the past, we're talking about past reporting. What's going on now? I don't hear anything anymore. And I mean, I've been working on podcasts lately, and I'm trying to make this relevant again. And it's really hard to get audiences to listen and to watch. They're all sick and tired of the misery. So how do you get a story like that out there when there is all the other misery that competes with it? And so yeah, I'd like to open the floor to you guys. How do you do that now? And it's a challenge that I think all of us are facing. So yeah.
I'm just taking a couple of questions at the same time, just so we can get as many voices in as possible. Is there any more questions? Yeah, at the back there, or yeah, the gentleman here.
Another question, but I have a comment. Thank you so much, guys, to come here. But I was surprised that none of you talk about Buddhist religious fundamentalists and radicalists who call in genocide against the Rohingya. And also, I was wondering, the word radical that Aela you use, is that word only reserved for Muslims? Because Western journalism always use, when the situation involves Muslims, the word radical. And as a psychologist, I can understand when we have a difficult situation, we all radicalize in a different ways. We become more liberal, more conservative. And this is, I think, human nature. So that's all I would like to say. Thank you so much.
I'll just take the one from the woman at the back there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentations. My name's Eleanor, and I work for the Eyewitness to Atrocities project at the International Bar Association. My question is really to Tirana. Would you like to see more collaboration between journalists and human rights investigators in terms of collecting witness statements and photos that meet higher evidentiary standards?
Okay. So, shall we start with the first one?
Sure. I'm very familiar with your project. So what I would say is that I'm not sure if it's just on the outside of the Rohingya. I think that on in a lot of conflicts and human rights crises, we do collaborate very closely with journalists. I wouldn't sort of have the expectation, or I don't, that we would expect them to be taking photographs of a different evidentiary standard. I think that, for example, if we take Paddy Brown from Panos, for example, he brought me to a particular location. He's an outstanding photographer. His photos he was on assignment for UNICEF. And it was actually because of him that we went and found a particular group of witnesses, and then I was able to ask him, could you take some photographs of the entry wound or the exit wound or whatever it might be. So I think that, you know, you have different levels of collaboration. When covering Bahrain, for example, you know, I've had very generous photographers, or even in Libya covering Gaddafi's death, photographers who have said, here, you can take my stash of photographs just for evidentiary purposes, so you can go through it and see if it can corroborate. So I think that, you know, there have been photo agencies and bureaus, actually. I remember in 2012 having access to some of the wires gave us all their video just so that we could go through it to look for lines of inquiry where we could do the sort of investigation we do. So I think the possibilities, I think that partnerships already exist. I think it's very much based on individuals, and you have to trust them. Like, if we're going to publish this, we will pay you for this. And so I think that there is the possibility of it. I'm not 100% sure. I'd need to put more thought into it about whether we need to raise the photographers journalists doing the work, for them to meet the evidentiary standard. I'm not sure. Be very honest with you, I'm not sure that even, you know, we are human rights, we document human rights abuses. We are advocacy and campaigning organizations. Even organizations like us, are we really, you know, when it comes to evidentiary collection and proving chain of custody, there are very few organizations who are actually able to do that to the criminal investigation standards. So it would totally change the way we work. And I'm not 100% sure that we're quite ready for that. But I think that there are multiple points for partnership.
Okay, really quickly, how do you reach people on this story when there's massive fatigue about it? It's the same thing with the Syrian crisis, right? For me, it's tell a story people don't expect. You know, they hear about the misery all the time. What else? There's one scene in I'm Rohingya where Jamalita's dancing. I've never seen a story on Rohingya where they're dancing. Life does go on. They have a life outside of their human misery. Find that. That's the best answer I can give you. To the gentleman's point over here, I absolutely 100% agree with you that this idea of radicalisation is problematic, which is why I prefaced it with saying I wish there was a different way to say this. But Al Jazeera has made a lot of inroads into addressing the language that we use as reporters. You're not allowed to use the word radical on Al Jazeera. Back in 2012, when I did the film on Wiratu and the radical monks, I characterised them as radical Buddhists. And that was a new concept. People were like, hang on, Buddhists are sitting there meditating. So you are challenging popular narratives, and that's always difficult. It's kind of a no-win situation. I'm going to be besieged on Twitter today from all your tweets from both sides. I'm going to get Buddhists saying that I was too favourable towards the Rohingya, and I'm going to get the Rohingya saying I was too favourable towards the Buddhists. It is absolutely polarised. Every time I speak publicly about this issue, I am slammed. Death threats, rape threats, you name it, right? It's going to happen. And so it's almost become part of, you know, I'm moving past that, and I'm trying to find language that is much more inclusive. But what I was trying to say with the radicalisation element is it didn't exist there before, and now Buddhists are using that language. There were people back in 2012 calling for genocide. There was Facebook groups that were called "I want to genocide Muslims and their father," right? Crazy stuff that wouldn't have existed if it was in English. Facebook would have taken it down, but because they switched to Burmese, it was allowed to spread. So against that context, you have terrible, problematic things on both sides. I hear you.
Can I just very quickly?
Very quickly, yeah.
I think that people are telling the other part of the story. This isn't over. It's just morphed. You're now seeing the ethnic cleansing 2.0. They are erasing Rohingya villages. They are taking the farmland. They have harvested, the military has harvested the rice, which means people have nothing to eat. There is no humanitarian aid going in, so people are still going into Bangladesh because they are starving. I don't know why the media doesn't want to tell the stories. We're putting out the press releases.
Can't get up there.
Yeah, no, but we've done it through satellite imagery, for example. We've been able to show some of this stuff. It's getting a different audience now, so we're taking those straight to policymakers. Because we're pushing for bans on weapons sales to the Myanmar military. We're pushing for travel bans, targeted sanctions on individuals in the Myanmar military. You've got to send clear messages. We're evolving past the horror, and we have to get to the action. So the story is evolving slightly differently, and we need to reach different audiences as well. So I think it's part of a strategy, but the more we keep this in the public domain, because that's how policymakers care. They care if you care, not you as media, but you as citizens and potential votes.
We're out of time. There's just one thing we'd like to mention very quickly at the end, if we may. Hannah still has 2 colleagues who are sitting in jail. Hannah can't talk about it, but thankfully I have 2 people who can. Can you just give a quick summary of what's going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, Walloon and Chosu were arrested for their reporting on the Rohingya crisis, and they are locked up indefinitely. We don't know what's happening. They have young families. This is something we can't put up on the screen, but it is an issue that, as journalists, we are all very concerned about. This goes, for me, to the heart of what Aung San Suu Kyi's government really is actually culpable for, which is press freedom. As a reporter who covered the times during the military dictatorship and who covered now, press freedom is as bad as it has ever been in Myanmar, and that's something that we really should remember and be writing stories about.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. Tirana Hassan, Hannah McKay, Aela Callan. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.